Best. Hey, quick question before we get into this one. Have you ever looked at a map and noticed a blank spot? Not a lake, not a restricted area, just a place where the data stops, like the map itself decided to look the other way? Drop a comment and tell me about it. And if you're new here, subscribe. You're going to need to hear how this ends. So a retired Yellowstone ranger reached out to me about 6 weeks ago, 31 years on the job, third generation Wyoming. He said he'd been trying to get someone to listen for almost a year. He sent me everything, GPS logs, trail camera photos, internal reports that came back stamped with 2 words, no action. I'll let him tell it. My name is Frank Ewing. I'm 56 years old and I spent 31 years as a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park. Before that, I was a wildlife biologist specializing in ungulate migration, elk, bison, pronghorn, the animals that move across the northern range in patterns so old they predate the last ice age. I've spent my entire adult life learning how those animals think, where they go, and why. I can stand on a ridge above the Lamar Valley in mid-September and tell you which bull is going to breed which cow, which satellite herd is going to split off toward Specimen Ridge, and which calves from spring aren't going to make it through their first winter. I'm not saying this to impress you. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that when I tell you something is wrong with the elk, I'm not guessing. Something is wrong with the elk. I took early retirement 8 months ago. I'm writing this from my kitchen table in Bozeman, Montana, 90 miles from the park boundary. I haven't been outside in 3 days, and I don't think I'm going outside today either. I'll explain why. But I need to start at the beginning, and I need to be precise, because I spent 5 months trying to get the people above me to take this seriously. And every time I wasn't precise enough, they found a reason to ignore it. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I found, exactly what I saw, and exactly what I think it means. And then you can decide for yourself whether I'm a man who lost his mind in the woods or whether there's something in Yellowstone that has been there longer than the park, longer than the name, longer than anything we have a word for. I need to start with the collars. Every year, the park's wildlife division fits GPS tracking collars on a sample population of elk across the northern range. The collars ping a satellite every 4 hours and transmit the animal's coordinates, elevation, ambient temperature, and movement speed. If the animal dies, gets taken down by wolves, hit by a car, drops from disease, the collar detects the cessation of movement and begins transmitting a mortality signal. Different frequency, different ping rate. We get an alert, send a team out, confirm the death, collect biological data, recover the collar. It's clean, efficient, well-designed technology. I've worked with those collars for over a decade. I trust them the way I trust my rifle. They don't guess, they report. Last March, I was reviewing migration data from the previous 2 years as part of a seasonal summary report, routine work. The kind of thing I could do in my sleep and often did, half a cup of coffee in, radio on low, clicking through spreadsheets of coordinate logs. It's not glamorous, it's the backbone of everything we do. I noticed a cluster, 17 collared elk, 14 cows, 2 bulls, and a yearling had all stopped transmitting within the same general area over a 26-month period. Not all at once, spread out across seasons. The first collar went silent in January 2 years prior. The most recent had been the previous November. 17 animals, 17 separate collar failures, all inside a roughly 6 square mile zone in the northeast quadrant of the Mirror Plateau. Now, collar failure happens. Batteries die, straps break, the units get damaged in falls or fights. You lose maybe 3 or 4% of your collared population per year to equipment malfunction. That's normal. What's not normal is losing 17 in the same place. The statistical probability of that happening by chance is so low that when I ran it through our modeling software, the program returned an error because the number it generated had too many decimal places. And here's the thing that made me set my coffee down and sit up straight. Not one of those 17 collars transmitted a mortality signal. They didn't die. They didn't report a carcass, they just stopped. Mid-ping in some cases. One collar transmitted its 6 a.m. position, coordinates deep in the plateau, normal movement speed, normal temperature, and then never pinged again. No 10 a.m. update, no mortality signal, no degradation pattern you'd see from a failing battery. It was broadcasting, and then it was not, like someone had reached into the signal and pinched it shut. I pulled up the coordinates of all 17 last known positions and plotted them on a map. They formed a rough circle, or not a circle exactly, an oval, like a thumbprint pressed into the plateau. The center of that oval sat in an area I'd never personally visited, though I'd been within a few miles of it dozens of times on backcountry patrols. It was high meadow country, lodgepole pine, old thermal features, the kind of terrain that looks the same for miles in every direction, which is part of why it's so easy to walk past something out there and never know it was there. I tried to pull up the center point on our mapping software, CalTopo, which is what we use for most of our backcountry work. The map loaded the surrounding terrain without any problem. Ridgelines, drainages, tree cover, the thermal vents over toward Pelican Creek, all rendered in clean topographic detail. But the area where the oval sat came up as a gray rectangle. No contour lines, no elevation data, no satellite imagery, just flat, featureless gray, like a redacted section of a classified document. I thought it was a glitch. I refreshed the page, same gray rectangle. I switched to Google Earth, same thing. The terrain rendered beautifully in every direction, and then there was this hole, this absence, like someone had taken an eraser to that one section of the Earth's surface. I tried the USGS National Map Viewer, which is the most comprehensive topographic database in the country, and it showed the same blank space. 3 different mapping platforms, 3 different data sources, all agreeing that this particular piece of ground did not exist in any way that satellites or surveys could record. I tried one more thing. I went back to Google Earth and zoomed in slowly, watching the imagery load tile by tile. And for about half a second, maybe less, I saw it. The meadow. A pale oval clearing surrounded by what looked like white trees. The image was blurry, like the satellite had been moving too fast or the lens had been slightly out of focus, but it was there. And then the tile refreshed, and it was gray again. I took a screenshot in that half-second window. The file saved to my desktop. When I tried to open it, my computer told me the file was corrupted. I tried 3 times. Corrupted, corrupted, corrupted. I checked the file size. It was 0 kilobytes. The screenshot had saved as an empty container, a name with nothing inside it. I sat at my desk for a while after that. There's a particular feeling you get after 30 years in the backcountry, a feeling that doesn't have a good name. It's not fear, not exactly. It's the feeling you get when you realize the map you've been using doesn't match the ground. When the ridge you're standing on isn't where the contour lines say it should be, or the creek is flowing the wrong direction, or the tree line is 1,000 feet lower than the data says it is. For a few seconds, your brain tries very hard to make the world fit the map, because the map is what you trust. And then you accept that the world is what it is, and the map was wrong, and you are in a place you don't quite understand. That's the feeling I had, sitting at my desk, staring at a corrupted file that should have shown me a meadow that shouldn't exist. I flagged the collar data in my report and forwarded it to my supervisor with a recommendation for a ground survey of the area. That was March 14th. I got a response on March 19th on 2 sentences. Report acknowledged. No action required at this time. I filed it again on March 22nd with additional statistical analysis. Same response, same 2 sentences. I called my supervisor directly. He told me the plateau was inaccessible until snowmelt and that he'd revisit the recommendation in June. He sounded like a man reading from a card. That was the first time I felt something shift in my chest, some instinct I couldn't name, telling me that the bureaucratic indifference I was hitting wasn't laziness. It was something else. Like the report was landing on desks and then simply ceasing to matter, the way those collar signals cease to transmit. Present, and then not. I waited until June. I filed the recommendation again. This time, I didn't get a response at all. So I called a friend at the U.S. Geological Survey, a geologist named Pat Hendricks, who I'd worked with on thermal monitoring projects in the Mud Volcano area. Good man, rigorous. The kind of scientist who won't tell you what time it is without checking 2 clocks. I gave him the coordinates and asked him to pull whatever the USGS had on that section of the plateau: geological surveys, thermal data, historical mapping, anything. He called me back 2 days later, and his voice sounded different. Careful, like he was weighing every word before he said it. He told me the coordinates I'd given him didn't appear in any federal mapping database going back to the original 1872 Hayden survey, the expedition that mapped Yellowstone for the first time and led to its designation as the world's first national park. Every square foot of the park had been cataloged by that survey team. Ferdinand Hayden was obsessive about coverage. His cartographers walked the entire plateau with theodolites and measuring chains, documenting every valley, every hot spring, every meadow. Except this one. Pat said it wasn't listed as unmapped or inaccessible. It wasn't flagged as a data gap. It simply wasn't there. The survey records showed the surrounding terrain in perfect detail, and then the documentation jumped past that 6-square-mile zone as though it didn't exist. As though the survey team had walked up to its edge, continued on the other side, and never registered the gap. Like walking around a piece of furniture in a dark room, your body adjusts its path, but your mind never acknowledges the obstacle. Pat asked me how I'd gotten the coordinates. I told him about the collar data. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Frank, I've been doing geology in this park for 18 years. I've never heard of this place, and I just spent 2 days looking for it in every database I have access to, and it's not that the data is missing. It's that there was never any data to miss. There's a difference." I asked him what the difference was. He said, "Missing data means somebody collected it and lost it. This is more like nobody ever collected it in the first place. 150 years of surveys and not one team ever pointed a piece of equipment at this spot. That's not an oversight, Frank. That's a pattern." He told me to be careful. I could tell he wanted to say more. He didn't. I decided to go see it for myself. I asked a younger ranger named Lucas Diaz to come with me. Diaz was 28, former Marine, 3 years into his time at Yellowstone, and sharp enough to know that the park held things that weren't in the training manual. He'd done backcountry patrols with me before, and he was the kind of partner I trusted. Quiet, observant, didn't fill silence with chatter. Good with horses, which mattered, because where we were going, there were no roads and no trails maintained for foot traffic. We rode out on a Tuesday morning in late July, took 2 horses from the Lamar Buffalo Ranch corrals, and followed the old Hoodoo Trail up onto the Mirror Plateau. It was a clear day, 72 degrees, wind out of the southwest at maybe 6 or 7 miles an hour. Perfect backcountry weather. The plateau was green from a wet spring, and the wildflowers were still going in the subalpine meadows: lupine, Indian paintbrush, arrowleaf balsam root. The kind of day that reminds you why you took a government salary to work in the most beautiful place on earth. We made the plateau by early afternoon. From there, I navigated by compass and topographic map toward the coordinates where the collar signals had died. The landscape up there is disorienting if you don't know it. The lodgepole forest is dense and uniform. Trees the same height, the same diameter, growing in stands so regular they look planted. You can walk for hours and feel like you're not moving at all, like the forest is scrolling past you while you stand still. The plateau is also thermally active in places, which means you'll come across sulfur vents and hot pools in the middle of the forest with no warning. The ground itself isn't always trustworthy up there. We rode for about 3 hours after reaching the plateau. The horses were fine for the first 2, calm, steady, ears forward. Then something changed. It happened gradually. My horse, a 12-year-old quarter horse named Dutch, who I'd ridden for 6 years and who had never once spooked on me, started shortening his stride. Not stopping, just pulling his steps back, like a man walking toward the edge of a cliff who doesn't want to admit he's nervous. His ears went flat, not pinned back in aggression, but flat sideways, the way horses hold them when they're listening to something they don't like and can't locate. I looked over at Diaz. His horse was doing the same thing. Diaz met my eyes. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. We'd both been around horses long enough to know that when 2 experienced trail horses independently decide they don't want to move forward, you pay attention. We dismounted and led them on foot for the last mile. They came, but reluctantly, and I could feel Dutch pulling against the lead rope every few steps, leaning his weight backward like a dog that doesn't want to go to the vet. Then, the lodgepole started to change. The transition wasn't sharp. It was more like a gradient. Healthy trees gave way to thinner trees, which gave way to trees with sparse crowns, which gave way to trees that were standing dead. And then, we were at the edge. The meadow was exactly where the collar data said it would be. I've seen a lot of Yellowstone. I've seen the Grand Prismatic from the air. I've watched wolves take down a bull elk at dawn in the Lamar. I've stood on the rim of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone during a thunderstorm and felt the falls vibrate through the rock under my boots. None of those things prepared me for what it felt like to stand at the edge of that meadow. It was roughly oval, maybe 1.5 miles across at its widest point. It was ringed by dead lodgepole pines, not burned, not beetle-killed, just dead. Standing deadwood, stripped of bark and needles, bleached bone-white by years of sun and wind. They looked like enormous antlers driven into the ground, hundreds of them, forming a perimeter that was almost too regular to be natural. They should have fallen. Dead lodgepole in Yellowstone typically stand for 5 to 10 years before rot and wind bring them down. These trees looked like they'd been dead for 50 years, and they were standing perfectly straight, not a single one leaning. Inside the ring of dead trees was the grass. I've been staring at grass my entire career. I know what healthy grass looks like, what drought-stressed grass looks like, what overgrazed grass looks like, what fire recovery grass looks like. I know the color of every species of native grass in this ecosystem at every stage of its growing season. The grass in that meadow was not a color I could identify. It wasn't brown. It wasn't green. It wasn't the golden tan of cured bunchgrass in autumn. It was faded, washed out. Like a photograph that's been sitting in a window for decades, the color slowly pulled out of it by light. The best word I can find is that the grass was exhausted. It looked like the idea of grass that had been used too many times. Waist-high, dense, and perfectly still despite the 6-mile-an-hour wind that was moving every other plant on the plateau. That was the first thing I noticed that made me stop walking. The wind was blowing. The grass in the meadow was not moving. The second thing was the silence. I don't mean quiet. The Mirror Plateau is a quiet place by most people's standards, but it's alive with sound when you know how to listen. Wind in lodgepole makes a particular whisper, almost like breathing. There's always birdsong, mountain chickadees, Clark's nutcrackers, the rough cackle of ravens. Insects in summer are a constant low hum. Thermal features hiss and bubble. The soundscape of a healthy Yellowstone meadow in late July is dense and layered if you stand still long enough to hear it. At the edge of that clearing, every sound stopped. Not faded, stopped. Like stepping from one room into another and having someone close the door behind you. The wind was still hitting my face, but it wasn't making sound in the trees. The trees themselves were silent in the way that only dead things are silent. No creak, no sway, no whisper of needles, because there were no needles to whisper. And beyond the tree line, in the meadow itself, there was nothing. Not the quiet of an empty room. The quiet of a room that has never had anyone in it. A silence so total, it felt manufactured. Intentional. Diaz said, "Jesus." Just the one word. His voice sounded flat and wrong out here, like the air didn't want to carry it. The horses would not cross the tree line. We tried for 10 minutes. Dutch planted his hooves and would not budge. Diaz's mare actually started backing up, which in 6 years of riding with Diaz, I'd never seen her do. We tied them to a healthy tree about 50 yards back, where they stood with their heads high, nostrils flared, looking past us toward the meadow with what I can only describe as focus. Not panic. Focus. Like they were watching something we couldn't see. Diaz and I walked the perimeter on foot. It took us just over 2 hours to make the full circuit, which told me the meadow was roughly 4 miles around. A big clearing, but not impossibly big for the plateau. What was impossible were the game trails. There were dozens of them. Worn paths through the dead lodgepole, cut deep into the duff and topsoil by years of heavy use. Elk trails, bison trails, and this is what made Diaz stop and crouch down and stay there for a long time. Wolf trails and bear trails. Grizzly tracks in dried mud, some of them old enough to be nearly geological, pressed into soil that had hardened around them like a cast. Wolf scat that had turned to powder. Every trail led inward, toward the meadow, into the grass. We could not find a single trail leading out. I've tracked animals in this park for 3 decades. Animals leave trails in both directions. They go somewhere, they come back, they migrate out, they migrate in. That's the fundamental pattern of every living thing that moves across a landscape. It goes and it returns. Nothing was returning from this meadow. I walked the inner edge of the tree line, the last few yards before the dead grass began, and I started finding antler sheds. Elk antler, mule deer antler, what I'm almost certain was moose antler, though moose are rare on the plateau. They were scattered in the grass at the meadow's edge by the hundreds. Different sizes, different ages, some of them clearly old enough to be partially mineralized. They were all oriented the same way. Points facing inward toward the center of the meadow, like they'd been dropped by animals walking in and never turning around. I picked one up. A 6-point elk antler that should have weighed 4 or 5 pounds. It weighed almost nothing. And when I closed my hand around the beam, it collapsed, dissolved, turned to pale powder that sifted through my fingers and fell into the grass without a sound. I stood there holding nothing, a ghost of bone dust on my palm, and Diaz was watching me from 20 feet away with an expression I'd never seen on him before and hoped to never see again. He pulled out his GPS unit. I watched him turn it on, wait for satellite lock, and then stare at the screen. He turned it toward me. The coordinate fields were blank, not zeroed out, blank. The elevation field was blank. The unit had satellite lock, full signal strength, and could not determine where on Earth we were standing. We were in a place that the satellites could see but could not name. I want to be clear about something. I'm a rational man. I've spent my life in science and land management. I believe in data, in observation, in the slow accumulation of evidence toward reasonable conclusions. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in curses. I don't believe in monsters. But I believe in what I saw. I believe in 17 collar signals going silent without mortality pings. I believe in 3 mapping platforms returning blank gray rectangles. I believe in 150 years of federal surveys that never once documented a meadow that's 4 miles around. I believe in game trails with no return path and antlers that turn to dust in your hand and a GPS unit with full signal that cannot find you. And I believe in the way Dutch looked at that meadow. Animals don't lie. They don't imagine things. They don't have the cognitive architecture for superstition. When a 12-year-old trail horse who has carried me past grizzly bears without flinching decides he would rather die than step into a clearing, that horse knows something. I reported what we found. I wrote a 6-page report with GPS coordinates of our approach route, photographs of the game trails and the dead tree line, descriptions of the antler deposits, and a formal request for a multi-agency survey team to be deployed to the site. The report came back 9 days later. 2 sentences. Report acknowledged, no action required at this time. Same language, same format, same dead end. Like my reports were walking into that meadow and not coming back either. I called my supervisor. I called his supervisor. I called the chief ranger's office. Nobody would schedule a meeting. Nobody would call me back. I started to feel something I hadn't felt since I was a young biologist, trying to get the state to acknowledge a chronic wasting disease cluster in a mule deer herd outside of Cody. This sense that I was pushing against something that wasn't resistance, but absence. There was no wall in front of me. There was just nothing there. My reports were received. My calls were logged. My recommendations were acknowledged. And nothing happened, and nothing kept happening, and the nothing had a quality to it that felt practiced, institutional. Like the park had been not responding to reports about this place for longer than I'd been alive. That's when I called Pat Hendricks again. And that's when Pat told me about the Hayden survey gap. And that's when I understood that this wasn't a new problem. This was the oldest problem in the park, older than the park itself. I should have stopped there. That would have been the smart thing. File the reports, document my observations, let it go, ride out my last 2 years to retirement, and collect my pension. I set up a trail camera instead. It was a Riconix Hyperfire 2, which is the standard camera we use for wildlife monitoring. Motion activated with a time-lapse backup mode that captures 1 frame every 5 minutes regardless of motion. I mounted it on one of the dead lodge poles at the meadow's edge, about 8 feet up, angled toward the clearing's interior. I set the time-lapse to run for 7 days and swapped in a fresh set of lithium batteries and a 128 gigabyte SD card. Then, I rode out. That was a Saturday. The following Saturday, I rode back alone. Diaz had a scheduling conflict, which I accepted at the time but think about differently now. He'd been quiet since our first visit, not unfriendly, just reduced, like someone had turned his volume down. He stopped asking me about the Meadow. He stopped asking me about anything related to the plateau. Twice, I found him looking at me from across the station with an expression I couldn't read. And both times, he looked away the moment I met his eyes. Something had shifted in him out there at the tree line, and whatever it was, he wasn't going to talk about it. I rode out alone and retrieved the SD card. The camera had captured 4,712 images over 7 days. I loaded them onto my laptop that evening at my quarters near Tower Junction, poured a bourbon, and started clicking through them. The first 4,711 were exactly what you'd expect from a time-lapse of an empty meadow. The same washed-out grass, the same dead trees at the edges of the frame, the light changing from dawn to midday to dusk to the gray-green of the infrared night mode and back again. 7 days of nothing. No elk, no bison, no birds landing in the grass, no wind moving the blades. The meadow sat there in frame after frame after frame, and in every single image it looked exactly the same, not similar, not consistent, identical. Like the camera was taking the same photograph 4,711 times. I flipped through them fast, watching for any change at all, a shadow shifting, a cloud reflected in the grass, anything, and found nothing. The meadow did not change. The light changed around it, but the meadow itself was static in a way that living landscape is not and cannot be. Image 4,712 was different. It was a night shot, infrared, time-stamped 3:14 a.m. The camera had been triggered by motion, not the time-lapse interval, which meant something had moved in its detection zone. A bull elk stood at the tree line, 10 yards from the camera, facing it directly. A big 6x6, maybe 700 pounds, in full velvet. He was standing in the position elks stand when they've been alerted, head up, ears forward, body squared toward the perceived threat. Except the perceived threat was the camera, or me by proxy, and elk don't square up to trail cameras. They glance at them maybe and walk on. They don't pose. Behind the bull in the meadow grass were more elk. I counted them. There were 43. Cows, calves, yearlings, and at least 3 other bulls. They were standing in the grass at irregular intervals, like pieces on a board, and every single one of them was motionless, not grazing, not bedded down, standing, all of them facing the same direction. They were all facing away from the center of the meadow. I've watched elk herds my entire life. They don't orient uniformly unless there's a threat. When a wolf pack approaches, the herd faces the wolves. When a bear appears on a hillside, the nearest animals turn toward it and the rest take their cue. A herd of 43 elk, all facing the same direction, means something is behind them that they are watching, that they are locked onto with the kind of fixed, unblinking attention that prey animals give to the thing that is about to kill them. But they weren't facing outward, toward the trees, toward the world. They were facing inward toward the tree line and away from the meadow's center. Whatever they were locked onto was behind them, in the middle, and they were arranged so that not a single one of them had to look at it. I zoomed in on the bull in the foreground. The resolution was good. The Reconix shoots at 4 megapixels in infrared, which is enough to identify individual animals by their antler configuration if you know what you're looking for. His eyes were open, wide open. In infrared, elk eyes typically reflect back as bright white circles, the tapetum lucidum bouncing the IR flash back at the sensor. His eyes were reflecting, but the reflection wasn't round. It was the wrong shape. Elongated maybe, or fragmented, like looking at a reflection in broken glass, and behind the reflection, in the pupil, there was something that didn't belong. Not a glow, not damage, a quality, a wrongness that I can't describe in technical terms because I'm not sure technical terms exist for it. I've looked into the eyes of 10,000 elk. I know what an elk's eye looks like the way you know what your mother's handwriting looks like. And what I was looking at in that photograph was not an elk's eye. It was something else wearing an elk's eye, something looking out through it from a long way away. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a while. I finished the bourbon and poured another. Somewhere out on the Lamar, a wolf howled, and the sound was so ordinary, so completely and perfectly normal that it nearly broke me. Diaz quit the Park Service 2 weeks later. He didn't give notice. He didn't turn in a formal resignation. He just stopped showing up. His locker was cleared out. His quarters were empty. I tried calling him 3 times. The calls went straight to voicemail, and the voicemail box was full. I asked around, and nobody had spoken to him. One of the admin staff at Mammoth told me his separation paperwork listed the reason as personal, which is the box you check when you don't want to explain. I never heard from him again. I think about Diaz a lot. I think about the way he looked at me those last couple of weeks, not with fear exactly, but with something adjacent to it, a recognition. Like he'd figured something out that he wasn't willing to say out loud because saying it would make it permanent. I think he understood what the Meadow was before I did. And I think that understanding was the thing he was running from, not the Meadow itself, the understanding. Because once you have it, you can't give it back. I was slower. It took me longer. I had to go back one more time, but I need to stop here for a minute. I need to get some water and check the window. The elk are still in the field behind my house. There are more of them today than yesterday. I'll tell you what I found when I went back in October. I'll tell you what the elk were doing. And I'll tell you why I think the Meadow is not a place. Give me a few minutes. I'm back. Sorry about that. The elk moved off while I was away from the window. There were 9 of them in the field this morning. I counted. That's 3 more than yesterday. I'll come back to that. October, I went back to the Meadow on October 11th, alone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't file a backcountry travel plan, which in 31 years of service I had never once failed to do. I understood on some level I couldn't articulate at the time that if I filed the plan, the coordinates would land on someone's desk and the trip would be quietly canceled. A scheduling conflict would materialize. A reassignment would come through. The soft, practiced nothing would swallow my intention the way it had swallowed everything else. So I packed my gear in the dark, saddled Dutch before dawn, and rode out while the Lamar was still silver with frost. I brought a handheld weather station, a FLIR thermal camera, a sound level meter, and a field journal. I also brought my rifle, which I'd carried on backcountry patrols for decades as a precaution against grisly encounters. I want to be honest about why I brought it this time. It wasn't for bears. The ride up took longer than before, not because of the terrain or the weather, which was cold and clear, but because Dutch fought me the entire way. He'd been reluctant in July. In October, he was something else. He stopped at creek crossings he'd forded 100 times. He shied at shadows on the trail. Twice, he tried to turn around completely, and I had to dismount and lead him forward with my hand on his halter, talking to him the way you talk to a frightened child, steady and low, knowing that the words don't matter as much as the sound. But I could feel his pulse through the leather of the halter. It was fast, much too fast for the effort of walking. We reached the plateau by noon. The aspens on the lower slopes had already turned, and some of the high meadows were going golden, but the closer we got to the coordinates, the less the season seemed to matter. The lodgepole thickened, the light flattened, and the sound began to drain out of the world, not all at once this time, but in layers, like someone slowly pulling channels off a mixing board. First, the birds went quiet. Then the wind dropped to nothing. Then the insects stopped. And finally, the silence of the dead trees ahead swallowed even the sound of Dutch's hooves on the forest floor, so that we were moving through the woods in a silence so complete that I could hear my own blood in my ears. Dutch stopped about 200 yards from the tree line. He would not go farther. I tied him to a spruce and walked the rest alone. The meadow was the same dead perimeter, the same exhausted grass, the same impossible stillness in what should have been an October wind. But there were 2 differences, and both of them changed what I understood about this place. The first difference was the trail camera. I'd left it mounted on the dead lodgepole 8 feet up, secured with a cable lock and a ratchet strap. The camera was gone. Not stolen, gone. The ratchet strap was still there, still cinched tight around the trunk at the correct height, still buckled, still locked. But the camera was not inside it. The strap was tightened around nothing. As though the camera had been removed without unbuckling the strap, or as though the strap had been fastened after the camera was already absent. I checked the cable lock. It was still secured. The loop of braided steel still circling the trunk, still padlocked, uncut, intact. I stood there running my hands over the strap and the cable for a long time, trying to find the rational explanation. There wasn't one. Someone would have needed to cut the strap, remove the camera, and then reattach the strap and relock the cable. Or the camera had simply ceased to be there. The way the collar signal ceased, the way the survey data ceased, the way my reports ceased to generate any response. Things entering the orbit of this place and being quietly subtracted from the world. The second difference was the elk. They were in the meadow, not 43 this time. More. I couldn't get an accurate count from the tree line because they extended into the distance beyond what I could resolve with binoculars, but I estimated between 150 and 200 animals. A herd that size would represent a significant percentage of the park's entire northern range population. They were standing in the grass the same way they'd appeared in the trail camera photograph, motionless, evenly spaced, all facing outward, away from the center, toward me. Except this time in daylight, I could see their condition. They were thin, not winter thin, not drought thin, but something else, diminished. The bulls had dropped their velvet and their antlers were hard and polished, but the antlers were wrong, too symmetrical, too clean. Antlers in the wild always carry imperfections, broken tines, asymmetric points, scarring from sparring. These antlers looked like the idea of antlers, like a drawing of antlers by someone who had studied photographs but had never touched the real thing. The cows were the same. Technically correct, but subtly emptied of the small variations that make living things alive. Their coats were uniform in a way elk coats never are. No scarring, no patches of winter hair coming in unevenly. No ticks, no mange, no mud. They looked like taxidermy, like museum displays arranged in a diorama of a meadow that someone had built to show what elk looked like, designed by someone who understood the general concept, but didn't care about the details that make the concept real. And they were watching me. Every single one of them was looking at me. Not at the tree line, at me specifically, tracking my position as I walked along the perimeter. Their heads turned in unison as I moved. 200 animals pivoting together like a single organism wearing 200 elk-shaped pieces. I raised the FLIR camera and pointed it at the nearest cow, about 40 yards inside the meadow. The thermal display should have shown a bright silhouette. Elk run a core body temperature around 101 degrees, and on a 40-degree October afternoon, they light up like lanterns on thermal imaging. The display showed nothing. Not cold, not warm. The same flat temperature as the grass, the air, the ground. The elk were thermally invisible. They were not generating heat. They were not alive in any way that a thermal camera could detect. I lowered the FLIR and looked at them with my own eyes. The nearest cow blinked, slowly, one eyelid descending and rising with mechanical precision, the eye beneath it reflecting the October sky in a way that was slightly delayed, like the reflection was arriving from farther away than the sky. I turned on the sound level meter. In a normal environment, even a quiet one, you'll register 30 to 40 decibels of ambient noise. Wind, insects, distant water, the rustle of your own clothing. The meter read -4 decibels. I didn't know the instrument could read negative numbers. I checked the calibration. It was correct. The meadow was not just silent, it was actively subtracting sound from the air. It was quieter than nothing. I don't know how long I stood there. My watch said 40 minutes. It felt like 10. Time at the edge of that meadow didn't move the way it was supposed to, and I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean that when I checked my watch against the sun's position, they disagreed by about an hour. The sun was lower than my watch said it should be. I was losing light. I needed to leave. But I did one more thing first, and I need to tell you about it, because it's the part that wakes me up at night. I walked 10 steps into the meadow. I don't know why. That's not true. I know exactly why. Because in 31 years, every question I'd ever had about this park had an answer. Every strange sound was a known animal. Every odd behavior had an ecological explanation. Every mystery, when I was patient enough and careful enough, resolved into something I could write in a report and file and understand. I'd spent my whole life believing that the world was knowable if you were willing to do the work of knowing it. And the meadow was the first thing I'd ever encountered that refused to be known. And some part of me, the part that had made me a scientist, the part that couldn't leave a question unasked, needed to touch it, needed to stand inside it and feel what was there. I stepped past the dead tree line and into the grass. The grass came up to my waist. It didn't feel like grass. It felt like nothing. My legs moved through it without resistance, without the scratch and catch of real stems against fabric. Walking through it was like walking through a projection of grass. The visual was there, but the physical feedback was absent. 6 steps in, the nearest elk turned to face me fully, not just her head. Her entire body pivoted, smooth and frictionless, like a weather vane finding the wind. She was 30 yards away. Her eyes were open and her mouth was slightly open, and she was looking at me with an expression that elk do not have, that no animal has. Recognition. She recognized me, not as a human, not as a predator, not as a stimulus. She recognized me as a specific person who had been here before and had come back, and her expression carried something that I'm going to call satisfaction, because I don't have a better word, and because the feeling that came off her in that moment, yes, feeling I am a scientist, and I am telling you that I felt an emotion radiating from an animal that was not generating body heat, was the feeling of something that has been waiting and is pleased that the waiting is over. 8 steps in, I felt the pull. It started in my chest, not pain, not pressure. A direction, like a compass needle swinging to magnetic north, except the needle was somewhere behind my sternum and it was pointing toward the center of the meadow. And the pull was not physical. It was something worse. It was the feeling of being understood, of being known more completely than I had ever been known by any living person. It was the feeling of being seen all the way through. Every loss, every failure, every night I'd spent alone in the backcountry, wondering if I'd wasted my life counting animals that didn't know my name. The meadow knew my name. The meadow knew everything, and it was offering something I hadn't realized I wanted until that moment. Rest, not sleep, not death, not peace. Rest. The cessation of the long effort of being a person in a world that doesn't explain itself. The meadow would explain everything. It already had all the answers. The elk had walked in because the elk understood this before I did. The wolves had walked in. The bears had walked in. Every living thing that had stood at this edge had eventually understood the offer and accepted it. And the acceptance was not dying. It was something else, something the meadow needed me to take 2 more steps to understand. I took the 9th step, and the 10th, and then Dutch screamed, not whinnied, not nickered, screamed. The sound a horse makes when it's been gut shot, when it's broken a leg, when it's being eaten alive. A sound of absolute animal terror that came ripping through the silence of the meadow like a crack in glass, and it hit me the way a slap hits a sleepwalker. And I was suddenly awake in a way I hadn't been for the last... how long? I looked at my watch. I'd been in the meadow for 1 hour and 14 minutes. I'd taken 10 steps. The elk had moved closer. They were arranged in a loose ring around me, facing inward now, 20 yards away on every side. Their mouths were open, all of them. Jaws slack, tongues flat, as if they were panting except no breath was coming out. No vapor in the cold October air. 200 open mouths and not a single exhalation. I walked backward. I did not turn around. I don't know who told me not to turn around. Nobody told me. I knew, the way you know not to put your hand on a hot stove. I walked backward, counting my steps, and every step felt like pulling against a current that was running through my skeleton rather than the air. The pull in my chest intensified, and then, at the tree line, it released so suddenly that I staggered and almost fell. I caught myself on one of the dead lodge poles. The wood was warm, not sun-warmed, warm the way skin is warm. I pulled my hand away and kept walking. Dutch was where I'd tied him. He was drenched in sweat, flanks heaving, eyes showing white. The rein I'd tied him with had been chewed halfway through. Another 10 minutes and he'd have snapped it and bolted for the Lamar without me. I mounted up and rode. I did not look back. I covered the 3-hour return trip in just over 90 minutes because Dutch ran for most of it, and I let him because I wanted to run too. That night in my quarters, I wrote the last report I would ever write about the Meadow. It was 2 pages, not 6, not 12, 2. Because I finally understood that the length of the report didn't matter. The data didn't matter. The detail and the rigor and the 31 years of credibility I'd built didn't matter. The Meadow had always been there. The park had always known. And the institutional silence around it was not incompetence or laziness or conspiracy. It was the same thing the elk were doing. It was facing away from the center. It was the only sane response to something that cannot be fought, cannot be studied, cannot be mapped, and cannot be refused forever. My report said, anomalous zone confirmed. Recommend permanent exclusion boundary. No minimum distance less than 2 miles. Do not send personnel. Do not send equipment. Do not send anyone. It came back a week later. For the first and only time, the response was different. 3 words. We know, Frank. I took early retirement in December, moved to Bozeman, bought a small house on 3 acres south of town with a view of the Gallatin Range. I thought 90 miles would be enough distance. I thought if I left the park would leave me. The elk started showing up in February. The first morning, there were 2 of them in the field behind my house, cows standing in the snow about 60 yards out. I watched them from the kitchen window with my coffee and didn't think anything of it. Elk wander through the Gallatin Valley all winter. It's normal. The second morning, there were 2 again. Same spot, same 2 cows. I recognized them by their body condition and ear tag scars, and I felt the first cold thread of something that wasn't quite fear. The third morning, there were 4. By the end of the week, there were 6. They stand in the field all day. They don't graze, they don't bed down, they don't interact with each other. They stand in a loose line facing my house, and they watch my windows. When I move from one room to another, their heads track me. When I turn off the lights at night, they don't leave. I know because I've checked at 2, at 3, at 4 in the morning, pressing my face to the glass, and they're always there, standing in the dark, their eyes catching the porch light in reflections that are the wrong shape. They are not the same elk every day, or they are, and they're changing. I can't tell. Some mornings, the antlers on the bulls are different than they were the day before. Some mornings, the cows are standing in positions that are slightly closer to the house. Some mornings, there are more of them. Today, there were 9. I called Pat Hendricks last week. He didn't answer. I called his office at the USGS. The receptionist told me Pat Hendricks retired 7 months ago and left no forwarding contact. I asked when he'd put in his paperwork. She checked. December, the same month I retired, the same month I stopped asking questions. I tried to find Diaz, Lucas Diaz, former Marine, former Yellowstone Ranger. He doesn't appear in any search I've run, no social media. No forwarding address from the Park Service, no military records that I can access. It's as though he was never here. Subtracted, the way the camera was subtracted, the way the collar signals were subtracted, the way the survey data was subtracted. Not destroyed, just quietly removed from the record until the record reads as though there was never anything to remove. I'm going to tell you what I think the Meadow is. You won't believe me. I wouldn't believe me either. 8 months ago, sitting at my desk with a spreadsheet and a cup of coffee, and the unearned confidence of a man who thinks the world is made of things he can measure. But I've had 8 months to sit in this kitchen and watch the elk gather in my field, and I've thought about this every single day. And what I'm about to tell you is the only conclusion that fits every piece of data I've collected. The Meadow is not a location. It's an opening, an aperture, a point where whatever is underneath this landscape, underneath the crust, underneath the geology, underneath the caldera that everyone worries about, comes close enough to the surface to exert influence on living things. The Yellowstone hotspot is real. Everyone knows about the magma chamber. Everyone knows the caldera is overdue. But there's something else down there, something that isn't geological, something that the magma and the thermal features and the geysers are a side effect of rather than the cause. And the Meadow is where it breathes. The elk don't walk into the Meadow because they're confused or sick or lost. They walk in because they're called, the way I was called. The way the pull in my chest was not a hallucination, but a signal from something that has been calling living things into that clearing for longer than there have been elk, longer than there have been mammals, longer than there has been grass to camouflage the opening. And when they walk in, they don't die. The collars don't send mortality signals because the animals don't die. They become part of it. They're absorbed, incorporated, and then they're sent back out, wearing the shapes they wore before, but emptied and refilled with something that looks out through their eyes from a very long distance away. That's what's standing in my field. That's what watches my windows. And every morning, there are more of them. I don't know what happens when they reach the house. I don't know what happens when the circle closes. I don't know if it matters that I'm 90 miles from the park because I don't think the meadow is limited to a single location. I think the meadow is wherever it decides to open. I think the GPS goes blank and the maps go gray, and the surveys skip over it not because the technology fails, but because the place itself refuses to be pinned, the way a living thing refuses to hold still while you try to measure it. I'm writing this because my reports didn't work and my phone calls didn't work, and the institutional channels that are supposed to respond to threats have gone silent in that same practiced, permanent way. If you're reading this, you're the last channel I have. If you work at Yellowstone, if you're a ranger, a researcher, a seasonal, anyone, stay off the Mirror Plateau. If your GPS blanks out, turn around. If the birds go quiet around you, turn around. If the trees go white, turn around. If you see a meadow that doesn't move in the wind, do not step into it. Do not let it show you what it knows. The knowing is the hook. The understanding is the bait. It will feel like the answer to every question you've ever had, and you will want to take one more step, and then one more, and the elk around you will open their mouths but won't breathe, and the grass won't touch your legs. And by then, it's too late. If you're not at Yellowstone, if you're listening to this in your car, in your bed, in some city 1,000 miles away, I want you to remember something. Go outside tomorrow morning. Look at the animals in your neighborhood, the deer in your suburb, the birds on your power lines, the dog that sits across the street and watches your house. Look at them carefully, look at their eyes, and if the reflection is the wrong shape, go back inside and lock your door. Because the meadow isn't just in Yellowstone. The meadow is wherever something underneath decides to look up. This morning there were 9 elk in my field. I just checked again. There are 12. They're closer.